Okay, well, first we begin with names, and when I was born, I was given the name Hayden Fern Burgess. It's part of the signature of colonization. We were trained into speaking the English language and giving children Americanized names. If you really go back long enough, there's a story in Hawaiian tradition that for me, there was a covenant made that when I was to be born, I would be Poka Lainui. But I didn't discover that until many years later. So to introduce myself and to use a name with a culture that sees names in one particular perspective, they see it as what is your social security name, or what is your birth certificate name, or what is your passport name. And yet on the other hand, if you identify a person based on his cultural roots, in Hawaii it comes to a different name, because the names in Hawaii have different meanings. It's a prophecy of the future. It's a idea of what the internal character. It goes back into your ancestral history. Again, so to ask a person, what's your name? Where do you begin? Well, anyway, I use two names, and I do a lot of practice of Tai Chi and Qi Kung, which is a Chinese form, and I'm half Chinese as well, so there's also a Chinese name added to that. So it can get quite confusing. But the real question is, who are you? And is a name that really identifies you, or are there other characteristics that identify you? And so if we can just introduce yourself. Usually we begin with name, but then something deeper than a person, than merely his or her name, comes out. And so I think that's a more interesting aspect of an introduction of myself. So I'm a child of Hawaii, coming from multiple cultural background, both Chinese, Hawaiian, and American, Caucasian. Grew up in the island of Oahu, and lived in a community known as Waianae, a community you're familiar with. It has a history. Well, I won't go into too long of that history, because it will take us away from, I guess, the full introduction of myself. But the community is known as a community of rebellion. In the history of Hawaii, whenever the island of Oahu was taken over, the warriors of Oahu would seek refuge in Waianae. And then there's the idea that the spirits of the gods that inhabit the mountains, the valleys, the coastline, are very powerful, and they work upon the children of this area. And then they regroup and take over the island of Oahu and then rejuvenate themselves. So that's the ancient history of this place known as Waianae. I think to a certain extent I have been affected by that kind of forces, even though I may not know about the forces, or clearly about the forces. And as I observe this community, we have a history of tenacity, of rebellion, and yet when you convert it into the social criminal statistics of the community, we always rate as the worst, the highest criminal. But I think really it's a sign of the rebellion against what has happened here in Hawaii. And so there's different perspectives by which you look at the same events, different interpretations to it. And so I think I'm a product of that conflict. On one side, I've been very rebellious, and on the other side, trying to get into a system that is already here. So to be able to carry a rebellion within that system, or what one Buddhist bishop once told me, He said, remember that the quest is not to walk the straight path, but to learn to walk the crooked path straight. To get into the system. And if you're going to explode it from the inside, rather than standing on the outside and merely commenting, criticizing, and trying to destroy it from the outside. I guess Sun Tzu, who wrote the book The Art of War, talks about use whatever method is necessary, but learn to infiltrate, learn to work within the system. The thing is, oftentimes people think of working within the system as if it is to destroy the system, this idea of chaos. But sometimes the idea of working within the system is to improve the system. You can destroy the system, but you also, in the meantime, improve that system. So I think that is one way of identifying myself, coming from a community based on that kind of history. Personally, I grew up from a very poor family. We had 10 people in our family. My father was a truck mechanic. He went up to the 3rd grade. My mother went up to the 8th grade, and we lived in a very rural community out in Waianae. And I went through the public schools of Hawaii, and after that was able to get into the University of Hawaii. Somewhat unusual, I was the only child of my siblings to get into the university, and had from a very early age gotten somewhat involved in politics, first in high school politics, and then ran for political office. I have the sort of the reputation of being the youngest person ever to seek political office in Hawaii. When I think it was 18, I ran for the school board. I almost won. I lost the school board race. Then at 20, I got elected to represent this community in the Constitutional Convention for the state of Hawaii, 1968. And so I had been always concerned about the development of the society, commenting on what direction we were going. And always seen myself as a person who would try to remain active in the political life of Hawaii. I considered myself a very loyal American citizen. I grew up being raised in this public education system in which we had ground into us that we were U.S. citizens. We should be proud to be U.S. citizens, that the American government came in and protected us against the attack from Japan in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. I learned the American history, I think, quite well, and had always seen myself as an American citizen. After graduating from the University of Hawaii, and serving in the Constitutional Convention, I then went to law school at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., ran out of money. I didn't start with very much money. And it was unusual for us from Hawaii to be able to travel to America and then all the way across to the East Coast. It was very cold. I had not seen snow before that. And I had just gotten married, and my wife, Puanani, was getting sick. So came back home to Hawaii in 1969. And then I joined the military, the Air Force, during the Vietnam War. In line with the idea that that was part of my obligation as an American citizen. And so while in the Air Force, and I was stationed at Hickam Air Force Base here in Hawaii, and during a lunch hour, when I had nothing better to do, I went to the library at Hickam Air Force Base. And as I walked through the bookshelves, I came across a book I had never seen before, and it was titled Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And I said, what is this about? Going to the University of Hawaii, getting a degree in political science, trying to find out as much as I could about Hawaii, about its history and the rest. I had never seen this book, so I pulled the book off the shelf and I started reading it. Now I'm in uniform, right? In the Air Force uniform. And I'm reading a story of the Queen of Hawaii, writing the history of the collusion by the Americans and people in Hawaii to overthrow the government, how they landed in Hawaii, and they proceeded to aggress against Hawaii, taking over the government. And there's, of course, a lot of details. And then I started reading through the details and trying to get an understanding of what is this story all about. And as I read that book, I became enraged. I became so angry about having a story being told to me that had never been told to me before that. A person who went through all of their schools, went through the university with a political science degree, and now joining the military. I saw this massive fraud. Those who had controlled our education system, those who had controlled our media, those who controlled what books we were able to get to, there was a massive fraud that had been conducted. And so I started reading another book called Hawaii Pono by Lawrence Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S, out of California. And he showed the story of those people who were involved in the conspiracy against Liliuokalani. He also talked about the takeover of Hawaii and the subsequent giving of Hawaii to the United States and then making Hawaii eventually a state. And as I read that story, I came across names of people who were familiar to me, because these were many of them who served with me in the 1968 Constitutional Convention. And so I could see the chapters moving forward from Liliuokalani and her story and the close of her story to this conspiracy, the taking over and finally making Hawaii a state of the United States. And now they were simply carrying on with the continuing system of aggression in different places. At that time it was Vietnam. And the stupidity of people such as I, or not the stupidity, but the ignorance of people such as I, who just went ahead and volunteered to continue with this program of idiocy that was going on. I got angry, and so I wanted to make changes. And I saw that change would have to be made as we write the next chapter of Hawaii's history. And at that time, what I thought of doing was killing as many Americans as I could, or destroying systems, exploding buildings, and just going out and terrorizing. I was so angry. And so in part of the plotting and planning on how to do so, you come to the realization that if the plan is going to work for a long period of time, then you better not get caught. If you get caught, that's it. And the story is not told. And so the idea was, no, that's not going to work that way. And even if it did work that way, is that the right way through that use of violence? This guy who comes out of a different part of the world and his name is Gandhi had said something else. He said, capital punishment is not right. Why? Because it's so final. There's no going back and saying, oops. You cannot undo it after that. So I started thinking about how are we going to make the change, and how can we make the change long range, permanent, or as permanent as possible. And what is the change to be made? So I had an inkling, I had a general direction, but it still was not all that definite. But what I did know is that rather than exploding the system from the outside, I needed to get inside and explode from the inside. I could still be saying the same thing, but if I had some sense of legitimacy, if I had a law degree, then I can get into the legal system and I can start exploding within that legal system. So, I eventually went to law school following my military service. In the military, before I got out, I refused to salute the American flag. I've never saluted the American flag again. And as a result, I was court-martialed. At least I was charged. And fortunately, I was found not guilty of the refusal to obey a lawful command. Got into the first class that opened in Hawaii at the Hawaii Law School, subsequently named the William Richardson Law School. Graduated among the first graduates and told myself I would never work for the government, I would never work for corporations, which is the general practice of young lawyers coming out. I said, I'm going back to my community and work in the Waianae community. And so that's what I did, got licensed, came out to Waianae and started a very small practice with a typewriter, absolutely no money, and just decided to be a country lawyer, taking in a general practice. Whoever needed help in whatever area they wanted, I would try to help. Knowing that that's what I would be doing, I took every possible course that I could during the law school period. So I think I still have the record of having more credits than any other student. One semester I had 24 credits. The next semester I had 26 credits. I would just grab whatever courses I could take. The weirdest course, so I would create a course and try to create it because I knew I would come out. I wouldn't have a partner. I wouldn't have, anyone learning from anyone, so I had to do it that way. People would tell me, you're not going to survive even 1 year. No one can survive in this way, the way you intend to practice law. So I've been practicing since about 41 years, I think. And I still haven't had my license taken from me, although the rebellion and that kind of spirit has continued and carried out even during my law practice, which then becomes another chapter of an introduction of who I am. So I came out to practice law in Waianae. Prior to that, I was constantly concerned about the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty. People were not talking about it. As I went through law school, I had to struggle through the propaganda that is put out during the law school about the greatness of the legal system and sort of the honor and dignity of the law. And yet these were folks who had come in and stolen Hawaii and refused to address the underlying cause of why we are part of the United States. And as I spoke with my fellow students, some of them Native Hawaiian, they too could not understand or appreciate, because they too came through the school system that continually told us all that we should be good, loyal American citizens. And but I continued to share those ideas. When I came out to Waianae, I had that strong sense that if only I had a way of exploding the system, now that I have a law degree. And about a year into the law, with very little experience, I had a telephone call from my brother, my older brother, my troublemaking brother. he happened to be somewhat unfriendly relations with a person who was known in Hawaii as the underworld leader of Hawaii. He controlled all gambling, or most of the gambling in Hawaii. He was a native Hawaiian. His name, Wilford Kala'auala Pulava. And he teamed up with a Samoan chief, and they controlled major gambling in the islands. And along with gambling, you get into some other things, but basically it was gambling. He had gone to trial, charged with failing to file income tax returns while I was at law school. And I had commented to some friends and to my brother, if I was a defendant, I would challenge the very jurisdiction to be in Hawaii. Why should we have to finance our colonization by paying taxes to these foreigners? He was convicted, sent to federal prison. They also charged him in the state side with double murder and double kidnap. But that case, they ran into a mistrial. So he was serving federal prison time for tax evasion. And his sentence was even higher than Al Capone, who is highly known in the United States and died in federal prison. But Napi Pulava, they gave him a longer period. And his attorneys had appealed the case, and the higher court says, no, you exceeded the maximum you could give this Hawaiian. So they reversed that sentence. Anyway, when I was in practicing, my brother called and he says, hey, bro, we get one Hawaiian who need help. I says, so tell me something new. We all need help. He said, no, this guy was wondering if you would represent him. I said, okay, where is he and how do I meet him? He says, he's up in jail. He's up in federal prison in Washington State. And so he asked if I would go up and visit with this person. I said, okay, what's his name and how can I make the arrangement? He says, he's Napi Pulava. And that name at that time was getting more and more popular or well known in Hawaii because he was selling a lot of newspapers. The newspapers actually made him the underworld leader of Hawaii by this continual repetition of this Hawaiian. To a certain extent, there was an element of the locals, the natives, the Hawaiian, who had the audacity to take over the underworld, because the underworld was somewhat reserved to the Caucasians, to the Chinese, to the Japanese. And what they would do is use the Polynesians as the muscle. It was the Hawaiians or the Samoans. And what they would do from that is they would split the Polynesians. Either the Hawaiians and Samoans fighting with one another, or Hawaiian groups would fight with other Hawaiian groups and Samoans would fight. And so it was a very complicated Polynesian issue, but they were still being used as a muscle for the people who controlled the gamblings that was going on in Hawaii. So you had this character named Napi Pulava who says, why? A very powerful question. Why? We are the indigenous people of these islands. Why are we merely the muscle? We should take over the whole damn thing. So, through a number of different attributes that he had, one of which is his leadership and his charisma, he was able to take over the underworld, and he became the chief, the head, the one who ran things, or at least that was what was being reported by the newspapers. Okay. So anyway, that was his history. I had never met him, but his name was familiar. When I went up to the federal prison in Washington at McNeil Island, sat and met with him, and we had a sense of commonality. Both of us from Hawaii, both with Hawaiian background, and I'm being a lawyer, and he probably having more trial experience than his lawyer. So we discussed the case, not too much. He says, there's nothing more I can tell you. Go read the transcripts and the prior trial, and you tell me what we should do. And I said, it's hard to defend your case. The charge was double murder, double kidnap. And so I sat back and I says, Knapp, I'm not sure how you want to have your case defended. But if I was a defendant, this is what I would say. When they charge me with both charges, I would say, I refuse to dignify this court by even answering to your charge. I ask, who are you foreigners to come into Hawaii and charge us with your foreign laws? The underlying question is, who is the real criminal in this court? Is it the defendant, or is it the people who are running the court? His body, his face, he changed. He said, that's it. That's exactly what I want to say. And he says, but I never heard of such a defense. I wouldn't know how to put together such a defense. And I don't know what it really means. So I said, tell me about it. Tell me the story. And so I began to explain to him, one, the fact that, we had a nation. We were once an independent nation. An independent nation recognized in the international community as such. Respected by other nations, with a head of state, Kalakaua, circumventing the world, traveling to different parts, different capitals, and being accepted in many of these places that he visited. When he went to Japan, he had the highest commendation, the Order of the Chrysanthemum, I think it was called. When he went to Portugal, he asked the King of Portugal if he could have an audience with the king. Prior to his arrival, the cartoonists would draw, and the only familiarity they had of natives was from Africa. So they had a picture of an African stirring a big pot with a bone in his nose, ready to eat Portuguese. So that was the image of this Hawaiian. So he arrives on this ship, and he comes out with the finest clothing of Europe, and he speaks in Portuguese. He spoke 9 different languages. And then he said, yes, I would like to have an audience with the king. So he was granted an audience. He brought with him the ukulele, which is actually a Portuguese instrument. And he entertained the court by playing the ukulele in a way that they had never heard their instrument played. So he fascinated the audience in that way. And there are many stories of people who were in leadership in Hawaii who were able to understand, although we were the most isolated landmass in the world, and yet our leaders knew exactly what was going on in the European area, in the Asian area. We had people who came to Hawaii from many of these areas. And so our leadership was able to speak the languages, and they would mix with the people. And there was a general integration. We came out with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, very similar to what was coming out in France, I believe it was. They kept up step for step with the development of the liberal thinking that was occurring in Europe. They picked it up in Hawaii. How did we know what was going on in Hawaii? If you look at what Kalakaua would do, he would be sure that every ship captain who came into Hawaii would have his first dinner with the king. You know, quite an honor. But Kalakaua would also pump him for information about what was happening around the world. So Hawaii, although isolated geographically, was not isolated intellectually. So that we were the most literate nation in the world by about 1840, 1850. They took to Germany the genealogical chant of Hawaii called the Kumulipo. And they made a comparison with the Kumulipo, and they juxtaposed it with Darwin's theory of evolution. And one conclusion was that this recording of genealogy was the greatest record ever written by man. How can that be when you have all of these great stories of Homer's writing of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and all of those writings? They say this is the writing that has recorded even before or from the very time that the dragons, the mo, would roam the earth. And there was no break in the genealogical tracing of how we come from that period all the way down to the human individual today. You know, in Western history, you have the period, for example, of the Dark Ages. There seems to be a gap. But for the Hawaiians, they could trace all of these movements. And they traced it not only in terms of the human being, but they also traced it to the spiritual development and how it comes out. So the Kumulipo was that document that established, or one of the documents that established Hawaiian genius in the world. All of this we never heard about. You know, we were taught that we were stupid people, we were drunkards, we were dependent on the American government because they came in and we needed their support to survive. So the images were quite different. And so here I am sitting in a jailhouse in a federal penitentiary sharing these ideas with a person who had felt this pride of being of this history but not knowing the history, and yet himself finding a way to fight against the system. Myself not coming through his background, but having more sort of an academic, intellectual approach with a political science background. And so we're talking about, okay, so how do we put the pieces together, and how do we wake up the society to the fact of the illegalities that occurs in Hawaii? Because at that time, no one else was talking about Hawaiian sovereignty. There's a practice, not only in Hawaii, but in many other places, a martial arts practice, many martial arts practice. And they talk about using the force that comes at you and being able to turn it and use it against the opponent. Sometimes in the Aikido practice, it says to do it lovingly, so that as you turn it back, you don't hurt the person. Other people say, nah, if they're going to attack you, you get right back to it. How do you take that philosophy? Because the newspapers, tying up with the, quote, legitimate system, or the legal system, or the established system, or the occupying system of Hawaii, are all jumping at this particular individual and making him a big crook, turning even the native people against this person. And so what we said was, okay, let it go. let us enter into the arenas that they create for us, and let them bring all of the forces of accusation upon us, and then switch it around and use the courtroom as a theater of education. We couldn't buy the publicity. We couldn't buy the opportunity, the attention. We are poor people. One guy in jail, the other guy out in Hawai'i trying to survive in his small little practice. But let them give it to us. Let them bring it to us. And so it occurred in that way that while he was still in federal prison, I, representing him, when he was charged, the media was all in the back row of in the courthouse. The judge was up front, the prosecutor was next to me, and so we go up before the court, and the prosecutor says, on a certain day at a certain time, your client did kidnap and murder these two people. How do you plead guilty or not guilty? And I responded by saying, we refuse to dignify this court by even entering a plea. And then I said, we ask, who are the real criminals in Hawaii? We are not American citizens, we are Hawaiians. The judge had not heard that defense previously, and I had known exactly what he needs to do. He cannot then find my client, my defendant, pleading guilty. We haven't pled guilty. We challenge the system. He can only do one thing within his boundary, which is to enter a not guilty plea, which means I will have a trial. So I didn't need to plead not guilty. I'm still entitled to a trial. But more important, which people do not fully appreciate what is going on, is that while I'm facing the judge and I'm telling the judge what our plea is, I'm speaking to the media, who I expect now to sell your newspapers. But it's not the story that you anticipated you would be telling. It would be the story that we will tell. It will be first a shock into his denying that he is even a U.S. citizen, which is very new in Hawaii politics or Hawaii society. And then we would follow up with education, education, education. And so that is the system in which people go through. First getting slapped on the head or getting whacked in the face. That's how you teach a mule, right? First you got to get the attention. After you get the attention, then they go through a state of confusion. And after that stage of confusion, then they begin to become more familiar with the facts as you lay it out. Then the next stage is discernment. And the next stage is understanding and in practice. Those are stages of education. And that is, to a certain extent, how we began this Hawaiian sovereignty movement. So we went through a trial. There was the longest trial in Hawaii's history. And every day of that trial, we conducted ourselves. And then after that, I saw this movie about Gandhi. And you know that rascal, what he would do? He actually followed the way we did it. Or vice versa. So when the judge would walk in or out of the courtroom, or when the jury would walk in or out of the courtroom, Napi Pulava would not stand, because he could not give credence to the validity of the case. And we conducted the whole case in this manner, and I always raised the issue. There was one time I raised the motion to dismiss on the grounds that the court has no jurisdiction over Napi Pulava. And so what I did was I presented in support of my motion the speech or the message of President Cleveland to the joint houses of the U.S. Congress in 1893, December 1893, in which after Minister Blunt had done the investigation in Hawaii, had reported to Cleveland, Cleveland says, okay, based on that, I cannot send the treaty for ratification to the U.S. Senate. And so I'm withdrawing the treaty. And in that address, he sets out the details, the landing of the American troops, the violation of international law. Essentially an act of war. And he says we have committed an act of war against a peaceful, trusting, and confiding nation. He lays out the case better than any other spokesperson could, better than Liliuokalani could. Why? Because he was an American. He was a president of the United States, relating this to the U.S. Congress. And as I laid out that story, reading from the congressional record in a very old book that was falling apart, the judge is looking at me and saying, be careful with that. That's an old volume. But the thing is, he could not deny any of those facts. If I cited a native Hawaiian historian, they would fight it. They would say, oh, it's not true. It's, it's not a fair rendition of the history. But in this case, it's part of the congressional record. The judge came out in his conclusion. He says, this is the most fantastic story I have ever heard. I had never heard this story before. And yet I sit here as a circuit court judge. Before that, I was a member of the state legislature. Before that, I was a member of the territorial legislature. I am married to a Hawaiian woman. My children are native Hawaiians. And yet I had never heard the story, which is all true. But he says in his conclusion, however, we have all benefited by being Americans today, and so I deny your motion. There's no legal reasoning behind it. It's politics. It's a failure to uphold his obligation to follow the law. Oftentimes what happens is when you come across these issues, the courts and other lawyers continually say, yeah, but you're not talking about American law or domestic law. You're talking about international law, which doesn't apply. I said, oh, is that right? The Constitution of the United States, Article 6, says that all treaties adopted pursuant to the Constitution is part of the law of the land. And every judge in every court is obligated to abide by the law of the land. How can you then create this block between international law and domestic law and pretend that it doesn't apply? It's a treaty. Hawaii had all of these treaties. The treaty with the United Nations, the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, obligates the United States to follow the law of the land. And here you are excusing yourself more not because of principle, but because of interest. Protecting your interests. The courts have not appreciated my commentaries about that. And so from there we rolled into other cases. I was challenged, and I challenged the federal district court. They threatened to take my license away. So we went through that. Then I represented others. Someone called me and he says, hey brah, you don't know me. My name is Walter Paulo and I live in down Sand Island, and they're going to throw us out pretty soon. And I've been reading the papers, and the paper tells me about this illegalities, the overthrow, how the Americans came in. It's something I never heard about. And about Cleveland addressing Congress. Can you come down and can you talk to us? And so for that, I went down, and that's just an example of what was happening now in Hawaii, where people would call me and ask me can you come down to our home? Can you come down to our school? Can you come down and talk to us about these things? And so the word of Hawaiian sovereignty began to expand, and then other people started also taking these positions. When you see or when you become involved in a movement, then you have a particular perspective. It's a personal perspective because that's where you had been involved in. And for me, that is my particular perspective in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, from the legal side and then trying to spread it out, and also seeing now other people coming back to Hawaii and picking up these causes. Kekuni Blaisdell, Trask Sisters, and others, to see that they too could see that history, how they unwound that history and how, or what kind of conclusions they reached is one thing, based on their particular background, their particular education, their particular experience, as opposed to many of us who have different backgrounds. And so as you look today at the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty being advocated in Hawaii, you can see the many different colorations, the many different experiences, and how we come out with sort of different conclusions. But although that may be the case, I suggest that 95% of what is being said is all the same thing. We like to differ over the 5%. And sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's exasperating, but then it's good because it also helps us to clarify what the heck is the issue? What is the real cause? What are we trying to achieve? Which comes back, for me, to the earlier questions when I was back in the Air Force. What is the next phase of Hawaii? And so that also helps to, I guess, go through the fire and purify what you really want. So in a previous conversation, I was talking about, I support Hawaiian sovereignty. I believe Hawaii should be an independent nation. And yet that is not the final goal. That is not the ultimate. That is not the fruition of all of what we have gone through. So the question is, then what is it if it's not independence? I thought that was what the discussion was. But I think it's something more important than that. One of the fears is that, yes, we are engaged in sort of a rat race. We are constantly going back and forth and trying to survive and trying to, I guess, gain an upper hand. But again, this Archbishop of the Daihonzen Chosen Ji, a personal friend of mine, he says, hey, watch out. You might win the rat race, but you're going to end up being a rat. Is it really worth it? So practical, this guy is so practical. And he's absolutely correct. What are we really trying to achieve? Domination? To elevate the native Hawaiians above everyone else here in Hawaii? To take over and decolonize so that we are in charge of a system that still leaves ingrained in the society the philosophies, the approach to life, the economic system, the social system that has been brought in by the Americans, that we already know does not fit our island situation. It may be good for somebody else, but certainly it's not developed by us. It's not our expression of what life should be about. What is this idea of self-determination? Is it really the self, or are we merely mimicking a foreigner's way of how life should be? I've been involved in a number of constitutional conventions, or how do we create a constitution? And then we get caught up with only seeing it through the eyes of the foreigner, through the eyes of those who told us this is what a constitution is. One, it has to be a written document. It has to have the head of state. It has to have this, this, and that. And so we begin to immediately jump into the development of a constitution with a king or a president or a governor or whoever it is, and a legislative body and the rest. And as we go back, even the way we interpret our history, what constitution should we replicate for our history. Constitution of 1839, whatever the number is. And so what we need is much deeper analysis of these questions. What is a constitution? Is it really a document, or is it something that is inherent in a person or in a body or in a society? How are you constructed? How are you constituted? In the Hawaiian language, we will say, Peha ko piko. What is your center? What is your core? I'm not asking you for your birth certificate. I'm not asking you for a passport. I want to know what makes up who you are, how you relate to your environment, to your family, to your ancestors, to the fish in the ocean. That is your constitution. And so, as we talk about self-determination, we need to have the self analyze, who are you? Where do you come from? What are your dreams for the future? Don't mirror image somebody else and what they have done, but develop your own statement of what the future should be. And if it's merely a replication, a copycat process, oh, this is what the American Constitution is, so this is what our independent nation Constitution. You have not decolonized, you have merely switched who is going to be at the head of the government. Decolonization is something completely different, and that has been a fault of this process of decolonization by people who do not think, who do not do this self-evaluation. They merely mimic what somebody else has done. So you look throughout, whether it's Africa or the Pacific or other areas, and you look at nations that have decolonized, and you read their constitution, they are a mirror image of the last colonizer over their areas. So what we need to do is dream. What we need to do is debate. What we need to do is try to clarify what is the core of our people. What is a deep culture that moves and shapes our people? What is our hopes and dreams for our society, for the world? And then ask, how do you interrelate with others within the society? And so I came across this suggestion. I've been involved in many other things besides just legal practice. I've advocated in the international arena. I've traveled. I represented the World Council of Indigenous People and did a lot of that work. So in that process and trying to analyze what are the stages, these appropriate stages of decolonization, how do we fit that within Hawaii? How do we fit that within the world society? And so I come up with 5 stages of decolonization. Stage number 1 is a process of recovery and rediscovery. When a people come to the stage that I went through, as an example, in the military, looking at my history and finding out, I never knew that. I didn't know this about my people. You know, you go into that rediscovery, and then you begin to recover your culture. You try to learn the language, you try to understand what those spirituality expressions within a dance or within a word or within a practice and all that stuff. And you get very deep into it, and then you start developing a sense of identity, a sense of pride. Where does it come from? It's not going to make you rich or anything like that. That's not a value that you're filling yourself with. But there's a certain essence that says, this is what your ancestors were. Okay, that's very interesting. And then you find that in the process, you have a colonizer who have come in, and essentially what have they said when they come across indigenous peoples or indigenous practices or people they don't understand? They say these are foolish people. They don't have any culture. They don't have any understanding. They have no religion. Look at their clothing. Look at the language. They don't even know how to speak the English language. They have no conception of God as created by the Catholic Church or whatever it is. And so you have the colonial attitude that oppresses the indigenous people, the very denial of culture of the people. And then what happens during that period is some of the people also join the colonizer in the denial. They say, oh yeah, my cousins and my uncle, and I come from an ancestry of foolish people. So some of them creep away and they join in the denial. So that denigration of the people. That's one of the stages of colonization. This is going to take too long to go through the various stages of colonization, so I will just get into the process of decolonization. But before I do that, let's take a very short break. So, these 5 stages of decolonization. The first stage is the recovery and rediscovery stage, in which you go back into some of the processes of colonization. But as you come out of that process, you recover and you rediscover, such as what we went through. We had such a nation, we had the king, queens, we had this process. So you build a pride in the people. And then you find out about the illegalities that occurred. The theft of the nation, the taking away, and all of the details of the landing of the American troops, and the events that occurred in Congress, the international arena, and all of that stuff. What happens to a people is very similar to an individual who is a victim of a crime. A woman who is raped. You're angry. You enter into a stage of great bitterness, anger, revenge. I call it the mourning stage, this anger stage. And as a stage continues on, you continue in that mourning, that grieving. And we also went through that stage. The problem with that stage, and people need to be very careful about it, is that when you have a public media that loves to whip around this claim of a free press, and then they interview those people who are the most angry or the most mournful or the most accusatory, they then create out of these people the so-called leadership of the movement. These are people elected by the others, but they are the ones that the newspapers would say, hey, I didn't see you throw a rock yet. And so they create this kind of conflict, which is what papers sell. And others who only see that as being reported tend to now back up those people because they share in the mourning, they share in the recovery and rediscovery. So you got to be very careful of the mourning stage. And so for us in Hawaii, we go through the mourning stage. Many other people go through this mourning stage. The issues in Europe and the breakup of Europe with, what do they call it, Baltic states, and that anger and that history. But sometimes when it happens too quickly, when independence comes too quickly, then you have all of that internal strife, the memory of how they killed a king or how this happened, that happened, and then you have this war, this terrible kind of friction. It becomes racist, it becomes very inhumane. Hawaii can or could have gotten into that if they said, okay, here's your independent nation, you go fight it out. Yeah, there would be terrible fights, right? But I think to a certain extent we have the benefit of not moving too quickly. We have to go through this next process, and that next process is probably the most important process. I call it the dreaming, in which you can sit, you can debate, you can argue about it, you can go into the history, you can go into what is the future, you get into these discussions about what is that new society that we want to create. You ask the question, are we saying that we should be an independent nation merely for historical justice because of the fact that we are the victims of a crime? Or are we saying not only that, that is only the basis, the legal basis upon which we are able to bounce ourselves into the future. But we also have to ask ourselves, where do we go into that future? What is that society that we develop? Is it going to only replicate where we had been and elevate the untouchability of our native leaders so that we don't even challenge their wisdom? And we say that if this is the way it was done, then this is the way it needs to be done. Or do we have the right to say, no, we learned from that lesson, but we also have had changes of the 125 years. We have new technologies, we have new expansion of different people, different philosophies, and all of that. Do we have the freedom as we go into our unfolding into our future, the right to make those decisions? And so this can be a very strenuous debate, because then people say, you are turning away against your own people, against your own history. And you respond by saying, no, I'm trying to improve the history to make sure that we are not simply buying into what had happened or buying in from someone else's history, but we have to apply our own genius to what the future is. That's part of the debate that we're going through here in Hawaii as well. My wife, Puanani, had been very active in this, what we call the Kahool Lave movement. It was a movement to stop the American military, the U.S. Navy, from bombing our island of Kahool Lave. And so we had some of our native people and others who joined in to sort of invade and take over the island, and they would get arrested, they would get thrown in jail, and then another sweep of movements that occurred. And she was very much involved in part of that movement. So finally they were able to get onto and establish themselves and build some legitimacy over their right to be on the island. So they said, we're going to build a hale, a house. So they put up the first pole in the house on the island. She and I would go to this woman, her name is Pilahi Paki, a kupuna, who has one foot in ancient Hawaii and the other in modern Hawaii. So she's talking with us, and she can relate historically, but she also relates spiritually to, as she said, the gods. I speak to the gods. Okay. However you do it, that's your kuleana. I don't know how you do it, but okay. She said, yeah, I speak to the gods. And so we would study with her. And we would study late at night into the early morning hours. And one question that Pua asked Auntie Pilahi, she says, Auntie Pilahi, we are on the island of Kahool Lave. We have placed the first pole in the ground. Our question is, where do we place the second pole? Do we face it east, west, north, south? Do we face it according to the winds? Where do we place the second pole? What would our elders do? What would our kupuna do? Auntie Pilahi looks at my wife and she says, Ovai oi, which means, who are you? That's sort of an awkward response. Who are you? So Puanani is caught. She says, I'm Puanani. She said, yes. And what else? I don't know what else. That's who I am. She said, are you not the descendant of your ancestors? Yeah, by definition, I gotta be a descendant of my ancestors. And so Auntie Pilahi says, do you have ears? Yeah. Do you have eyes? Yeah. Can you smell? Yeah. Do you have senses? Yeah. You have the same thing that your ancestors had, right? Say, yeah. So you do what your ancestors did. You use your senses, make up your own mind. Stop trying to replicate what others did simply because they're older folks, they did it before, and the rest. What they did was be a human being at that instance in time. Make up your own mind. Stop trying to redo what others have done. What would our ancestors have done today? Well, first of all, they're not today. We are the today. So when I ask the question, Where are our prophets of yesteryear who could prophesy, who could see into the future? Why even ask a question? We are the prophets. We need to take control and start unwinding and identifying what is the future for us here in Hawaii. Not simply replicate, but build, so that the society that we build will be a better society, a much more humane society, an appropriate society. And so we need to gather together and join in the dreaming. Allow all the voices into that house of dreaming and sort it out. It may take a long time. There's certain issues that can be concluded very quickly in that dreaming. One of the issues that we had in the earlier years of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, who are the Hawaiians? How do we define what a Hawaiian is? And so we had a very strong voices that came out and say, they are the native people. It's the blood that counts. Those are the people who we are talking about, who have the right to self-determination. Okay, that's one view. And yet, isn't it the case that our history tells us that the citizens or the subjects of the Hawaiian nation was also Chinese, was also Japanese, was also Filipino, was also Caucasian? So what it tells us, and especially when the Declaration of the Rights of Man, where the king signed the declaration saying that whereas God has created all men and all nations equal, how can we now say, no, but the native Hawaiians are better than equal? So somehow, forcing us to go back into our history and understanding that history tells us that perhaps we are being racist ourselves and we need to overcome our own racism in order to build a better society. So that what you have found is that over the years, people have come to that conclusion. Generally, not everyone agrees, but generally that's right. We are all entitled to be subjects or citizens or nationals of the Hawaiian nation. Okay? We can agree to that. Then someone asks a question, yeah, but what about us Hawaiians? The Hawaiian Hawaiians, us native Hawaiians. You mean everybody equal? Even us in our own homeland? Yeah, but they are equals among equals. And so you begin to be more precise. For the indigenous people of their own homeland, they should have a special place to protect that indigenousness. And so we recognize that. The human rights and fundamental freedoms of everyone should be recognized. And yet the indigenous rights of that particular population should also be recognized. Can we build a society that is fair and recognizes both rights? Let me go back to the earlier period when I was sitting with my major client, Napi Pulava. We're sitting at McNeil Island. He says, I've been away from Hawaii for a number of years. Can you tell me what is happening in Hawaii? I miss Hawaii so much. So I tell him about the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. And he says, oh, wow, that's terrific. What a grand story to hear that. And I said, but Napi, we're having a problem. See, the problem is we have Mama Loa, who says that she's the queen of Hawaii. We have Peggy Ha'Ross, who says, no, I'm the queen of Hawaii. Then we have Sammy Amalu, who says, wait a minute, I'm the king of Hawaii. And they all have genealogical claims, so they can say why they are these leaders. And then you have other people popping up and saying, oh, I'm the Kia Aina, I'm the Pu'onua, I'm whatever it is. What are we going to do with so many claimants? And he says, you have to see sovereignty as like a train. We're on a train of sovereignty. Our obligation is to stop the train whenever we see somebody who wants to join and wants to be on the train. And as they come on, we can say, who are you? Kamehameha the 17th? Okay, go take your seat. And who are you? Lili or Kalani or Queen, whoever it is? Okay, come on, take a seat. Please, don't fight on the train, okay? We all go ahead. And he says, whatever you do, no stand in front of the train because we'll run you over. On this train, you have two rails. It's not a monorail, it's two rails. It's old-fashioned. We are old-fashioned people. We have two rails. One is a rail of indigenous people's rights. The second is a rail of human rights, fundamental freedoms. Neither one of these rails should be telling the other one, go to hell, get out of here, move over. No, we need that cooperation. We need that sense of respect for one another and create that society, create that train in this way. That is appropriate for Hawaii. I think in these discussions that we have had, we have come generally to that. Maybe people don't really understand the image. But as you look at the various works that have been done, I think that is what carries forward, the respect, the common respect for one another. Part of that discussion also is, what is that fundamental, what do you call it, the motif? What is the fundamental character of the society that should be created, that Hawaii should lead into? What is a deep culture of the society? And let me see if I can explain deep culture in a very few minutes. You know, societies are built upon fundamental belief systems, so deep, so fundamental, that oftentimes they don't even ask, what are our basic belief systems? They just go along with a belief that they had grown up with. And so as you move from place to place, you will see in different societies, you have different expectations, things that were normal and natural, and everybody understands and works with that belief system. And then when you travel, you find, oh no, that's not the case. Not everybody believes in it. For example, if you go to Australia and you meet with the Aborigines of Australia, and it's the same thing if you go to Zimbabwe and you meet with the indigenous people of Zimbabwe. They have an idea of payback. You know, payback is so strong that if you do something wrong, it'll come back and hit you. You have to pay back. And even if you don't get caught now, it's still out there, you will get paid back. Now, some people believe that, oh, I can get away with it. But in payback, you can die. But your ancestors would eventually have to pay back. So if you went to Zimbabwe, and before that it was Rhodesia, I think Ian Smith was the head of Rhodesia, and they had battles between the blacks and the whites and all of those things, and how the theft of lands and all of that was taken over. And then they had a war for liberation. So during that switch between Rhodesia, did I say Indonesia? I misspoke. Rhodesia and Zimbabwe, you had wars. And so one woman who was regarded as a mule, she was carrying weapons across the border to support her people. She said the battles that we fought were not new battles. They were over 100 years. And she says, we remembered the names of the people, we remembered the events, and we were engaged in those wars. It had not ended. We were merely carrying out those things. And that was our belief systems. Even the ancient system of when you are in such a situation that you are being fired upon from every direction, there's no possibility of escape, and then you see an image of a deer, that jumps through and then jumps out of the window, and you have to immediately follow without thinking, and you just follow, and that's your escape. You know, their belief system so deep, but that was part of that belief system. Today we wonder, because we're not familiar with it, it's not part of our belief system. That's part of the deep culture there. For the Aborigines, payback is so strong. That's part of the deep culture. It becomes something normal, something natural, and something that will happen. The Japanese have a very similar system. You know, if there is an obligation from an ancestor, you need to pay back. If you borrowed money or whatever the obligation is, the children or the grandchildren has to pay back to make it come back to normal. Part of deep culture. What are our deep cultures? Have we ever taken time to try to understand? Why do we act? Why do we respond? Because we can never break out of a deep culture unless we understand that this is part of who we are. So there are many different areas to investigate people's deep cultures. The difficulty is that people don't understand that they have a deep culture. But if you show them other people's deep cultures, then they can see it. So what I normally do is I explain for our people here in Hawaii. I ask, what is our deep culture and what should our deep culture be? And so their general response is, I don't know. Easy answer, I don't know. And sometimes, oh, that's it. Deep culture of Hawaii, we have two major deep cultures. One that controls the formal systems of Hawaii. Our court system, our economic system, our environmental system, our education system, our monetary system. Those are based on a deep culture that has been formalized, that we see as normal and natural, and that's the way we operate. And they are based on three fundamental pillars, okay? The pillar of domination, the pillar of individualism, and the pillar of exclusion. Okay? And I use the mnemonic D-I-E, or die. Okay? Domination, individualism, exclusion. The way we deal with our environment. If I have a deed that tells me that I own 100 acres, I have the right to do whatever I want with that 100 acres because I have the right to dominate. The deed tells me I have fee simple ownership, and so I can dominate all of this. And sometimes, for some societies, I own to the very top of the world, or as far as I can get up to the top and as deep into the ground as possible. How can you create this feeble man or woman to say that you own all of this? The birds, the bees, they couldn't care less. They're going to fly across your waters and they're going to poop wherever they want to. But you have worked within this idea of domination because you have a deed. That is the way you work with the environment. And if you want to cut down the tree, although you have 100,000 birds that use the tree at night as their nesting place, that's okay. You have the deed, you cut it down. That's part of deep culture. That's part of the domination mentality just over the environment. And then you can apply it to education, the way we build our education system on domination. And then we start, the second part is also that individualism. Okay? So you elevate the individual above the rest of the group. What do you do? How do you do it? Grades. Let us grade you, and then we grade this bell curve, or however way you want to grade. And then at the end of the school year, you identify the smartest person in the class or in the school, and you let him or her be your valedictorian or salutatorian or some great speech maker. What's your statement about all the rest of us? We're all stuck as dummies. We are less than equal. But that's part of the deep culture. It's being bred within us so deeply. And they get into our education system. That's the way the society works. That's the way you need to operate. It's kind of a crazy system when you think about it. So I'm sitting at high school, Waianae High School. Okay? many of us native people, but many others non-native people. And the native Hawaiians, because especially our speech, pidgin English, heavy pidgin English. So I tend to sit way in the back of the class so that I don't get caught or get called on by the teacher because I hate to speak out, and I get made fun of because of my inadequacy of the English language. And many of us are like that. So the teacher walks in and she says, "Okay, students, we have a pop quiz today." And I go, "Oh, no, not a pop quiz. I hate these quizzes." So I have my good friend sitting next to me. Her name is Ho'ipo. And so the teacher says, "Okay, these are the 5 questions." She writes it on the board. And I want all of you to answer the questions, separate yourselves, and then I'll come back when you should have finished. Okay. So I'm sitting there and I'm looking at these questions. I come across question number 3. I have no clue what the answer is for that question. I said, "Ho'ipo, what the answer for number 3?" She said, "Poka, the answer for number 3 is," and she speaks loud, "the answer for number 3 is," and then the teacher walks in. And the teacher says, "Ho'ipo, what are you doing there?" She said, "Oh, nothing." "What do you mean nothing? You cheating?" "No, Poka, he doesn't know the answer for number 3, so I'm telling him the answer for number 3. She says, "You folks are cheating." I said, "I'm not cheating, I'm helping him because he doesn't know the answer." What is this all about? You have a culture of individualism, of domination, of who is the smarter and who is the not so smart. And then on the other hand, you have a deep culture of olu, of lokahi, of aloha, of helping, of cooperation. Lokahi, instead of individualism, lokahi, group, working together as groups, supporting one another. You have a cultural conflict. So we get nailed for violating the rules. The bell rings. We're out of school, or we're in the recess. The expectation among our folks is we got to support one another. We gather together. We share food. We share stories. We care for one another. We are very loving to one another. The bell rings again. You're in the class, and you're operating under a different deep culture. And they wonder why our children are schizophrenic, our children are mentally unstable. It's because they keep ping-ponging us back and forth. So anyway, the deep culture of the formal system, domination. If you can dominate over the other, whether it's in the economic arena, where you can capture the market, you can dominate over your competitors and, if possible, destroy and take over them, that's good. There's another system, in the informal system, the way families work together, the way friends, the way communities are supposed to work together, normally the way church organizations are supposed to work together. Instead of domination, it's called in the Hawaiian language olu. To be kind, to be gentle, to cooperate, to try to make sure that everybody survives, to support. We can still disagree, we see things differently. We can still think about, yes, I need to make a profit, but certainly not at the risk of destroying the others. So there's a softer way, okay? Olu. Instead of individualism, like in the school setting, there's lokahi. We're all part of a group. We have to protect the sanctity of all of us. We respect individuality, and you have the right to have your individual statements. But maybe you don't have the right to create nuclear weapon among your neighborhood, okay? So there's certain limitations to individuality because you still have to think about the general good, okay? And then this idea of exclusion. If you're not with us, you're against us. George Bush is famous for that. When he wanted to create war with Iraq, he says, either you're with us or you're against us. What a strange statement. No gray. Don't you understand the color gray? Between black and white, something in between. The Hawaiians also have the word called hapa. Okay? What are you? Are you black or are you white? I'm a mixture of many different races, many different religions. I'm cosmopolitan. I'm hapa. So you take a look at this character, not to demean him, this person. His name is Obama. Barack Obama grew up in Hawaii. When he goes to America, what is he? Black or white? Mother white? Father black? So their conclusion is, oh, he's a black president. He's also a white president. In Hawaii, he's hapa. Like most of us are in Hawaii. Not only racially, but culturally. Because we integrate, we come from a process of many different cultures. We have a thing called mixed plate. Very popular food dish in Hawaii. I think you can appreciate that. So what it has is, it's not only spaghetti with some rice and some kimchi and daikon and hot dog, all these things. It's a mixed plate. Others who come to Hawaii, when you say, let's go and get a mixed plate, they have no idea what you're talking about. Are we going to a French restaurant or an Italian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant? It's a mixed plate. We're going to mix it all up. This amalgamation is part of that contrast to exclusion. It's an idea of inclusion with a sense of humanity. It's, instead of exclusion, it's aloha, to be inclusive, respectful of one another, respectful of yourself. So instead of domination, individualism, and exclusion, you have olu olu, lokahi, and aloha. O-L-A. And in the Hawaiian language, it spells life, ola, life or health. So the underlying question is, as we reconstruct the Hawaii society, whether it's a Hawaii society or any other society in Middle America or in the middle of Europe or in the middle of China or any place else, what is the deep culture that we operate from? That defines your society more clearly than how it is governed, than what institutions you create. What is that underlying vibration that the society works on? And so what I am an advocate for is that we have to understand that we are at times victims of a deep culture if we don't understand that we are victims of that deep culture. But once understanding it, now we have an opportunity to take a look at it and start pushing for changing the deep culture into something that is more respectful, more humane, more appropriate to our society. And I think many societies need to go through this process of self-analysis, evaluation. I think that is even more important than the issue of Hawaiian sovereignty, Hawaiian independence, kings and queens and all of those things. That is good for the human being. But how the human being now relates to our environment, how it relates to one another in terms of economics, how we support one another, irrespective of the government form, because government forms only control one limited aspect of life, but the day-to-day interaction of human beings with each other and with our environment is affected by the deep culture that we need to be cognizant of. So I think that is where Hawaii really needs to concentrate on. What is the deep culture that we want to operate here in Hawaii? And I think, and of course I support switching to an Ola deep culture. As you switch to the Ola deep culture, Ola also involves the idea of pono, the idea of righteousness, the idea of appropriateness. Independence will come about as a natural fruition of an older deep culture. What is appropriate for Hawaii? Should the people of Hawaii govern themselves based on their own belief systems, based on their own hopes and dreams? The answer is obviously yes. So sovereignty is a natural outgrowth, but it has to start with the deep culture of the people themselves. Yeah. Okay, earlier I talked about the 5 stages of decolonization, and I think I went only up to the dreaming stage, which is the 3rd stage. Let me say that the dreaming stage is, to me, the most important stage, because that is a stage in which you engage, you talk about it, you do your analysis, and you sort of try to measure how it is to be carried out, change the story. You invite others to come in and join in the dreaming, and be sure that you do not isolate or leave other people out of that discussion. Why? Because when you come to the next stage of consensus, of building a sense of agreement, even if the person doesn't, even if the person agrees with the general conclusion, but if you have isolated or iced him out, he's going to be very upset about the whole process. He's going to say, I wasn't involved in the participation of the development of these dreams. And so you're going to create friction within the society that you hope to carry out these dreams. So you got to be very inclusive, although sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes you want to kill the opposition of the person who can't agree with you. But you have to be open, and you have to just engage in the discussion. Sometimes you're not the appropriate person to be engaging in that discussion. I had explained to many people that my father could not understand, could not accept that I would be court-martialed because I refused to salute the American flag. But for him, other people then spoke with him, and I would take him to gatherings that we would conduct. And then finally, after 7 years, he understood. He said, okay, now I understand. He was able to see also himself and what he came from and what had influenced him and how I was seeing these things. So one needs to have some patience or have other voices speak to others. Time is a very important healing mechanism. And so that's part of the dreaming process that we go through. And finally, out of the dreaming comes consensus. It may not come in one full-blown decision, but over a period of time, sometimes you agree as to, yes, we shouldn't be a racist community. We should allow various religions to come in. We should allow for different opinions, but we should always protect our environment. And so you have this discussion going on. That's part of that dreaming process. Consensus will come about, and after consensus, and it can come in many different ways, either through an election or a general agreement among people. And then you have execution or action stage, where you actually carry out the dreams. So the stages, again, just to be sure that we understand it: recovery and rediscovery, the mourning phase, the dreaming phase, consensus, and execution stage. Okay. So those are, at least for me, my idea of the 5 stages of decolonization. I traveled to Fiji once in a sort of a speaking tour, and I met with a person who was very much involved in the first overthrow, what we call, I guess, the Rambuka overthrow, where you had an elected body and then military who came in and was not happy with the person who was elected, so he overthrew the president. And then they set up a new system of governance. And then after that, there was another election, there was another overthrow. So as I spoke to this individual and explained the 5 stages of decolonization, his response was, you know, brother, unfortunately we had never heard that story. We had never heard this theory. When we became independent, when Fiji became independent, what we did was we immediately jumped into a system of governance that was left there by the British. And so it became competitive as to who would be the head of government. And so we actually continued with the deep culture of governance. It was just a matter of changing positions and who was going to now be the ruler. And unfortunately, we never had the opportunity to dream, to consult with one another, to try to draw this agreed dream of where Fiji would be. And so we have continued that battle, and we still have not had the opportunity to dream. So now it's the military who have taken over. And then after that, we try to convert to a civilian and then the military. But the dreaming is so necessary, and we haven't paused to do the dreaming. So anyway, I have suggested the 5 stages of decolonization as being appropriate, but at times the opportunities may not be there. What happened in the Baltic states, the timing was so quick. The understanding of history, the mourning was so strong that you had this hatred between one and another people. And who was that? Marshal Tito was not the strong man anymore. He was gone, and there was no continuing leadership to try to hold everything together. Everything fell apart. But if they had the dreaming, or had done the dreaming before that, you may have had a different result. Okay, anyway, in the dreaming there's going to be so many things that come about, but the willingness to let people sit back, be analytical, look at things, and try to construct or deconstruct and how to put things together without fear, creating a safe place where discussions can be carried on. That's very, very important, whether it's working within a very small system like the mental health system, in which you are wondering how do we get away from the colonization of the mental health system, where you have others with different ideas of how health is supposed to be, coming from a Western approach. And you have a community that says, hey, we are liberated. We want to develop our mental health system in our own idea, given our own history, given our own healers. How do we incorporate culture? How do we incorporate spirituality within your medical approach? So you have this clash. You have an opportunity for discussion, to take a look at these things. And so out of that, you get all of these wonderful discussions. One of the things, if I can share just for a few minutes and not to meander too far away, is as executive director of this mental health clinic, I'm the head of psychiatrists, nurses, case managers, peer support specialists, janitors. I'm the head of the institution. So when there's a meeting and this community doesn't have the ability to produce so much of the top, but we have a lot of peer support specialists, those who also suffer from mental illness, but who are also assisting others in the recovery, as an example. So when I say, you, go to this meeting, and they say, but I don't have a degree. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I don't know. I'm ashamed. I said, cut that out. You go to the meeting. You represent our organization. And then I said, not only that, but I want you to come back and I want you to report back as to what is happening. I want you to share the knowledge, share the experience. So they go. But what I need to do is I need to give them the courage, give them an analytical basis for their going there. So I say there's this thing that they use, we call it STEP. Be careful of this STEP. Okay? And so they give me that quizzical look. What the hell are you talking about now? So I say, hey, how do you spell STEP? S-T-E-P. S is system. They develop a system. They call it a mental health system, or they call it a pharmaceutical system, or they call it whatever it is, they call it a system. Whether it's a legal system, a medical system, psychological system, it's a system. Okay, we're going to deal with that. Okay. But after that S, then they come up with T. When they start talking to you, they start using these very technical terms. They start being so... You think you understand the English language? No, you don't. If you're talking with lawyers, they come up with all of these English, Latin, or even in English, it means something other than what you thought it does. So they will use terminology that is sort of specialized, and it sort of keeps you away from the discussion because you don't really know what they're talking about. And then you get embarrassed, you get shamed. So remember that T should stand for truth. Okay? Always ask them, what are you talking about? Don't be afraid. Get to the truth. Don't let terminology stand in the way. Remember that you have to head for truth. Understand what they're talking about so that you can break in and you can join in the discussion. The next thing they will come up with is E. They use E as the elites, for elitism. Okay? And you're just a commoner. You never went to medical school. You never went to law school. And if you did go to law school, what law school did you come from? I graduated from Harvard. I graduated from Yale. And you just from the University of Hawaii. Don't stand for that. Don't let them use this elitist approach. Remember that you're a human being just as much as everyone else is. You're entitled to be at that place. You represent our community. Switch the term elitist to equality, to egalitarianism. New word for you, okay? Egalitarianism. That means, hey, we're all equal in this meeting. So don't give me this thing about you being superior to me. S-T-E. Okay? And then finally they use the letter P. What do they do with P? They punish you. They push you out. They say, you don't understand? Well, why did they send you to this meeting? And they try to get you out of there because you're critical of the system. You're trying to get in and you're trying to say, hey, wait a minute. Our cultural practice has something to say about schizophrenia, or the idea of appeal to spirituality is important for one sector of our people. And they say, no, that's not what we teach in medical school. You cannot allow them to get away with it. So you switch that P to partnership. We are here not to be pushing anyone else. We are here to join in partnership. So what you do, you take that step and you switch it around and you make sure that you become a participant, a full participant. And then now you have encouraged them, you have emboldened them into these discussions. And that's why analysis is so important, and the sharing and the inspiring and the support of one another through this kind of analysis. Whether it's just within a small community group or sharing it with people from different parts of the world, to be able to engage in this kind of discussion is very, very important. So that's my story.